badass graphic novel that Garth and Matthew have made together, and it is amazing. I just got the PDF copy because of the moment that we're in, the crazy moment that we're in, hopefully not a rest of our lives scenario. And it's this beautiful thing about monsters and human reaction to them, and about monster creation, which is a particular interest of mine and always has been. I wanted to start out with just a little bit of discussion about the how this came to be, and we're going to start with Garth, I think, because it came out of a novel that Garth was working on that changed into this.
Yeah, in fact, the first iteration of the Cloven was as a short story for Hugo House. Hugo House is a literary center here in Seattle, and they do a literary series where they commission writers to write new works based on a theme. And they asked me to do it. I think it was 2011. And the theme was gods and monsters. And I came up with this. I bounced an idea off a friend of mine, Lynn Brunel, who's another Northwest writer. And I said, what's the next vampire thing? You know, because the whole vampire thing, it just played itself through here in the Northwest. And I was like, we got to be on the cutting edge now and ready for the next iteration, the next monsters. And we came up with this kind of idea of a kid. We had an image of a kid in junior high school running track, except he was way faster than everyone else because he was half goat, but he had to hide his feet because he didn't want to be discovered. And so I wrote that into an original short story for Hugo House, and it was good. I liked it, and people liked it. When I read it at the event, it was very successful. So I thought, I think I can do more with this. I want to do more. It's going to be fun. And so I wrote it as a novel. I got a first draft done of 100,000 words, and I gave it to my wife, Drella, who's my first reader always, and she read it and promptly said, no, this is not your next novel. It just is, it cannot be your next novel. You have to come up with something else. But I was like, but I really want to do something with this. And I said to her, what if I made it into a graphic novel? And she thought for a minute. She said, yeah, I think that might work. So I contacted my buddy, Eric Reynolds, who's associate publisher and editor at Fantagraphics Books. And I said, you got to help me out. I want to do this, and I don't have any idea what I'm doing. And we had a long, long discussion, and it ended with, you need to talk to Matthew Southworth. And then I did talk to Matthew Southworth, and now he and I have been involved in a long-term relationship for 3-some years, I think. Right, Matt?
That's about right.
So what happened in your head when you got this material? Did Garth give you a script? What did he give you?
Wow, it's been a long time. I think what I got first was maybe a copy of the short story.
Yeah.
You didn't give me the novel, did you?
No, I don't give anyone the novel.
Yeah, I didn't think. I was like,
it's wedged firmly in my computer. It's never coming out.
But so I read the short story, but to be honest, I don't really remember all that much from reading the short story. I remember most of the, initial experience was talking to Garth and sort of vibing on our sort of shared history, and shared enthusiasms. So that's what, very quickly it was like, oh, well, this could work. In some ways, the subject matter was sort of beside the point. It was kind of like, oh, yeah, we could be in a band together. That's the metaphor we keep sort of bumping into.
That makes so much sense. We're waiting for the soundtrack to come in. It would be so amazing if suddenly we heard the soundtrack of Cloven. I would be into that. But it's definitely like being in a band or like being in a theater troupe. I think that the collaboration between artist and writer, and the suggestion of, oh, maybe we could do this scene, is that, I'm sure that's something that happened here, is like which scenes to illustrate, which we all come from theater backgrounds, I think. In this area. So I noticed that for my own writing, that's always been, it used to be that I was always having people enter and exit, and as I got older as a writer, I cut the entrances and exits. But I noticed in this, it must be the same kind of thing. You're like, how do I get this character to appear here and feel active? And it's such an active script, I guess, is what I want to say, but active novel. There's so much action happening in the course of the Cloven, with people having surprise appearances. It just feels really theatrical. And I wanted to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that what happened was I gave Matt the short story, and then we talked a lot about ideas. And then I went to script. So there was like this weird pause, but we continued interacting for a long time. And he would be sending me character sketches and stuff like that, of ideas of how he saw things and what the look would be like and all that. And we had to deal with certain things like time. Because as a novelist, I jump back and forth in time a lot. That's you're allowed to do that in a novel, no problem. But with something that's like a graphic novel, you have to, the contiguous nature of certain parts of the story needs to be substantial. In other words, you can't cut back and forth every 3 pages or people would go insane. And so we really kind of worked on the structure of it sort of from the top down. But, like in a theater troupe, when you're doing it, if you're doing an improv thing or if you're working in a theater, as if you're rehearsing, it's not about any individual actor, unless that's Jack Nicholson, in which case it's about Jack Nicholson. But other than that, it's not about the individual. It's about the project. It's about the ideas. It's about the story. It's about the characters. And I think Matt and I both sort of put sort of our own egos aside and said, we're not going to worry about, what we have invested into this project. We're going to worry about the quality of the project. And so we'll make the cuts, we'll make the sacrifices, we'll add the things, we'll change things around without really having to worry about, well, geez, I wrote that lick and so I want it in the book. No, that's too much about one person. It's about Tuck and the Cloven. Tuck is the main character, and Cloven and the whole kind of arc of the story.
Yeah, it's been a much more collaborative experience than most comics experiences, at least that I've been a part of, have been. Usually what happens, especially in sort of corporate comics, like if you're doing something for Marvel or DC, I don't know why I just did that Rodney Dangerfield thing, but those, they tend to be like you're you're the demolitions expert and they send you the plan and you execute it. This has been much more like, the comics that I made when I was a kid, where it was like, well, then what if this happened? And then we sort of like fumble around with that. That does not mean that I've written anything or that I've significantly influenced the writing of it, but it's more like, again, it's kind of like a band. It's sort of like he said, like Garth said, he brings in the song and then we start playing it and go like, well, what if it got really loud in this section and it was really loud for 2 minutes? And he's like, I didn't think of that. I'm like, yeah, but it'll be awesome. So then we do that. And there's a shaping of it that doesn't normally happen in comics because they tend to be produced on a much tighter deadline. So it's much more just like execute instead of, to really mix metaphors, instead of feeling like you're cooking something together. That's what it feels like to me. It's like we're making dinner, a big, long, 120-page dinner.
So it's a band making dinner in a theater with a big stew pot and maybe some witches. I don't know.
Yep.
For 3 years.
There may be some toil and trouble somewhere along the line. It's true.
Right.
It's true.
I think everyone who's in this Zoom call room longs for that very scenario right now. We all want to be in a loud theater with some soup.
Oh,
next to each other.
It just really, now we've gone on our first tangent, it just kills me, the fact that, the first thing on the chopping block when it comes down to the nitty gritty is art. Is theater, it's music and live music, it's those things that you need to be present in order to experience in a temporal way. Those are the things they got to go during the virus.
But hopefully that means that people will suddenly go, oh my God, art and human contact. That's why I was going crazy the past 9 months or whatever it was. Like I needed human contact. I needed to, super tangent, but let's just go with it. So I was raised religious. I was never all that religious myself, and eventually became an atheist. And years ago, I was talking to my girlfriend about that. I wondered why I didn't miss going to church. So many people need church as a ritual. And she just very offhanded went like, well, that's because going to the movies, that's your church. And it was like she slapped me in the face. I was like, that's absolutely true. I go and I sit in a room and we all talk about or consider a topic, whether it's heroism or infidelity or whatever it is. And then 2 hours later, you come out having shared a thought with everyone, which I used to do quite often at the New Beverly Theater in Los Angeles. To me, that's the value of that sort of shared communal art experience. And while it's unfortunate that we're not able to do this more together in reality, it's cool that Zoom and stuff like this has become sort of a substitute for that.
Well, it's interesting, back to what's in the book, not because that was a tangent, just because this is actually in the book. We have Tuck, the main character, discovering that he can go on a romp with others like him. And it's exactly like the world that, like, from where we're standing here several months into this, it feels very similar. The idea that you could go out and compare notes with others about what are you, how does it feel to be you? I think we're all missing that as just humans in the world right now, but also that's something that we, I think, can do with these moments in a way that we've never been able to do with people from far off, and we're all in each other's readings and each other's like virtual events going, well, you've never come to something before and here you are, and we can actually see each other and feel each other's emotions in a more, I don't know, distanced empathy, I guess is what it is. Maybe this is what we'll learn from this moment. We certainly need some distanced empathy desperately in America. And your book is about that as well. The book is about how does a monster discover a monster, quote unquote. How does he navigate being human? He's both. He's right in the middle of it. And the ways that politics, we were talking about this earlier today, and right now we're in a deep, deep moment of monster creation societally, sort of monster creation in order to distract attention from other really the banality of evil elsewhere. Oh, here's a really bad monster. We're going to look at that instead. And so I think your book is so politically appropriate for the moment and so socially appropriate for this moment. And here you both live in Seattle, so we can talk a little bit about that if you'd like.
Well, it is interesting. We were thinking, back in March, we did have to have the discussion with Fantagraphics, our wonderful and awesome publisher. Are we going to stick to the date? Are we going to postpone? And we decided to stick, definitely, because we feel it's highly relevant, even though we're kind of encumbered by our inability to get out there to really promote the book in the traditional ways. We have to find new ways to do it. But right now, this topic is really important. I mean, just to back up half a step, Tuck, James Tucker, and people call him Tuck, is the main character of the book, and he's a genetically modified human organism. He's back in 1996, this billionaire Barry Goff established a laboratory on Vashon Island, which is off the coast of Seattle in Puget Sound. And it's where all the weird things happen. And he set up a lab to do biohacking. And he basically said, I'm going to end world hunger by being able to fuse the DNA of a goat into that of a human and create a human that has a digestive tract of a ruminant, thus creating a much greater supply of food that could sustain human life, right? It'd be a great answer. And they did it and it worked, but they couldn't get the hoofs out of the equation. So they had a bunch of these little mutant children who they basically were kind of part goat, part people, and they were going to mothball the project. And one of the doctors, one of the scientists, steals away the children and takes them into the Cascade Mountains and lets them go, because he can't stand to see his creations be euthanized. And so they work their way back into society. And how do they do it? They hide on the margins. They hide in the places where people don't want to look. In Seattle, we have a huge homeless problem. We have, the thousands of people living underneath the freeway in an area called the jungle. It's got a name, and no one wants to see it, and no one really wants to know about it, and the city doesn't want to pay attention to it, and the police are like, well, as long as no one's murdering each other too badly, it's like, it's really kind of not the correct solution for the problem. And so we wanted to call attention to that, metaphorically or symbolically or however you'd like to call it, by creating that similar situation with an actual mutant, which is a way of making people look at something that they think is sort of appealing because, oh, look, I'm reading a fantasy story, but in fact, it's not that fantastical, really, kind of at all. Mm-hmm. Which doesn't answer your question at all, but sorry.
More of a like talk here kind of. But it made me think about the Don DeLillo novel Underworld, which has a similar, which I'm sure you read. The underneath in the subway system beneath New York is what that novel's about, and it's about the invisible people who are invisible to the outside world.
And who get demonized, which is what you were saying. And I think this is an important aspect of what do we do in this society today, these days, if we don't like someone's opinion, we push it, we make it extreme. We demonize the opposition, right? Politically speaking, if you want to call it that. But, in Maria's book, The Mirror Wife, I mean, you read that book about, I guess, a monster mother with a monster child, or a human mother with a monster child, or and then the other mother the human mother is kind of a monster. I mean, but really when you see the two children playing together, they're just kids. So it really is a lot. It calls out people to say, what is the judgment that you're bringing to the table? Because you're bringing something. We don't, as Anais Nin would say, we don't see things the way we are. We don't see things the way they are. We see things the way we are. So we bring a lot of judgment to how we look at things. And I think that we are hoping to grapple with that in the kind of the trilogy that we're doing of the Cloven.
I mean, you absolutely have in what I read, just the first one, obviously, but the idea that you bring your own filter when you're trying to decide who your enemies are, who's the monster and who's the hero. I mean, The Mirror Wife is based on Beowulf, so I also have been translating. I've been working on Beowulf for so long, years and years, but we've been writing this story about who are those monsters? What can we do if we encounter a monster? How can you get status by smashing a monster for thousands of years? I mean, this is the quintessential human story about how to decide who you fight, and how you become a man very frequently is by fighting a monster. So this story, as is often the case in the history of storytelling, also has sympathetic monsters, and the monster POV is very important, but we also have human POVs who are furious at the fact that these monsters have gotten loose into the city. We have others who are sympathetic and are trying to help them find nurture. I mean, I just would like to talk a little bit about the concept of this comes also from thinking about Frankenstein, the concept of masculine nurture, the concept of like a male mother. I feel like Victor Frankenstein in the Frankenstein novel he gives birth to the monster. Sure. And in this case, we have a scientist who does the same thing. He gives birth to the new child, and then the new child has their many possibilities of like good and bad for the child, or children in this case. But I was just interested in your thoughts about this as a parent, actually. Epic question.
Wait a second.
Talk about everything.
Now I got to deal with I've got a 24-year-old, a 21-year-old, and a 13-year-old, and they're all monsters. That's all I'll say. But yeah, definitely, and Matt can attest to this, Frankenstein is a big model for this, as the framework of like a story, Frankenstein being one of the greatest stories I think ever written in I don't know, give me a scope, the English language, right? In the world. It's great. It's a great story, but it is about this idea of finding oneself and where one belongs. That's really, does anyone love me? I mean, at some point in book 2, the art of which we're working on right now, or, Matt's been plugging away, At some point in that book, Tuck turns to someone and says, "Do I have a soul?" Like, he doesn't even know. This is a creature who was created in a laboratory in an artificial womb, birthed, and then had his memory messed with so that he doesn't have any early child memories. And then he's raised basically as an experiment with a scientist as a pseudo mother who is taking notes. And they're trying to figure out what he's doing and how he's reacting. And so when he finally breaks free of that, he's essentially, jettisoned from this protective bubble that he's lived in his entire life. And then how does he find himself? How does he find out who he is? How does he create his own identity? And does he create his own identity, or does he let other people create his identity? How do we react as people? Do we, this is how with my kids, you're right. This is very essential to dealing with children growing up. How do they create their identity? And I have this discussion with my sons. Are you going to let someone else tell you what you are, or are you going to tell them what you are? Because as soon as you let someone else tell you what you are, that's it. Then you're down. You're basically on your back. You're submissive, right? You're allowing someone else to control your arc, your trajectory. And this is what Tuck is grappling with. And I think it's what hopefully most people grapple with, and hopefully we come out on the winning end, I guess. But we did. And Matt, talk about, we're going into imagery and stuff from Frankenstein. There's going to be a big scene in the book 2 about crossing the snowy trails of the North Cascades and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, I'm really excited about that part for several reasons. One is that, it takes place in the snow, and there's a whole lot less work drawing stuff that takes place in the snow. But it's also, just as a design challenge, it's more fun because it's acceptable to use fields of white. They're literally fields of white. The thing that you were just talking about, though, is really interesting to me for a couple of reasons. One, Frankenstein was my favorite book when I was a teenager, and I had this great illustrated version, illustrated by Bernie Wrightson, who was this great horror artist, and I loaned it to this girl in high school that I had a crush on, and she never gave it back, and I'm sure she never read it. But when you talk about the definition being defined and trying to decide, is your life trajectory your own, or is it someone else's? I had that experience when I was around 29, and I remember the advice somebody gave me was, you can be the hammer or you can be the nail. And it was such a simple, boiled down thing of I get to choose who I am just by which direction I'm going to place my self-definition. And the way I look at Tuck in the book is he doesn't know that possibility exists. He doesn't know, in book 1, he thinks he knows who he is. He finds out he doesn't know who he is. And now in book 2, he's going like you say, this sort of centerpiece of, do I have a soul? That's a gigantic question, it's Blade Runner, which is one of my favorite movies. So it's like we're sort of hitting all these things without doing cover versions of them, hopefully.
It's so cool to think about. I mean, Frankenstein, written by a 19-year-old girl who is in the throes of childbirth herself. And it's so cool to think of the sort of classic of major teenage growth is what that story is about. It's about I'm becoming an adult, and how do I do it? How do I end up in the world successfully and feel valued, is what the monster is looking for, that whole story. And in this book, it's interesting to see, Tuck feels human. He's raised to feel pretty human. He's wearing his shoes, it covers it up. He's I'm a little bit special, but nothing crazy. And then discovers that he comes the other direction. He discovers that he's a monster. And I think it's so relevant to pretty much everybody's journey throughout, the idea that you at different times in your life, you're both, all teenagers feel like they're monsters, and then have the moment where they're like, well, maybe I have to grow up and be a human. And it seems to me like this is what this story is about in a lot of different ways. The idea of having a crisis to grow into someone who maybe changes the world. I don't know what happens in this story, but it looks like that kind of story to me.
It's setting itself up for that, for sure. But definitely the Tuck he's searching for himself, but in a sense, he's also searching for his self-empowerment, right? In this idea that he can stand up and affect the world. So, going back to your original gambit of, what's going on right now in the world with Black Lives Matter, with the social unrest that's happening, with this, like, didn't we settle this already? Isn't this, why are we even having this discussion? But then you realize how insidious the, institutionalized racism is, how deep it goes, and how, maybe back in the 60s, we were like dealing with trying to get the weeds out by just yanking them, but we got to go down and get the roots. And so that's sort of where the idea of Tuck is going to go deeper. Hopefully we're trying to get to the roots, symbolically, at least.
With
a goat.
With a goat.
That's very, yeah. That's been we've talked about this before, but we started the book nearly 3 years ago or whatever, and now we're right smack in the middle of something defining the area where the book takes place, but we're already in the middle of it. So, with all the stuff going on Capitol Hill and all the questions about what's going on with equality in Seattle, which we were already dealing with, now they're like knocking on our door, which is exciting and a little terrifying, frankly. Like, we have this character, Jake. He's a reporter at The Stranger. The Stranger is the free newspaper, the Village Voice, RIP, of Seattle. Well, when I got the script, none of this Capitol Hill, Chaz, Chop stuff was going on, but I was already like, well, that's where he lives. And I'm drawing it now, and it's right smack in the middle of all that. I haven't drawn any sort of, civil unrest into the story yet, but I keep thinking, is there graffiti everywhere? Are things boarded up? Is it like a war zone? Are people wearing masks? Are they, everything's changing. And we were already kind of doing it weirdly. But now I have to draw it. That's what's strange.
Well, that's going to be fun, though. We're going to play with that a little bit.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of an intense experience when you're writing something that you think is sort of fantastical fable, but, with roots in the real world, but then to discover that you're like only maybe 1 year out from actual events. And I think that's been something that's been happening to all writers who write speculative stuff in the last few years. We were all like, here's the worst thing I can imagine. It's the dystopia. And then 2 days later, it's on the news. And you're just like, how do I keep my imagination running in a scenario like this? And yeah, let's delve into that a little bit. How do you keep this story going as the world looks increasingly like your story? I mean, we're doing some metaphoric things involving obviously hybrid human animals in your story, science version of that. That was very questionable how I just said it. And we're not there in America right now, but we certainly are in a place where monsterization is a new category every day.
I honestly
smashed every day.
Honestly, Maria, I think you'd be shocked at what is actually possible in the laboratory that doesn't get reported on, mainstream news, quite frankly. But you could check out our website, theclovenproject.com is a website we put together to promote the book, obviously. But it goes into like a lot of the research I was doing in the viability of genetic engineering and this sort of stuff. That's, really, we think, we hear things a little bit, but you know what, people, I got to be honest with you, by the time it gets to the New York Times, man, that stuff's been out there for a couple of years. I mean, everyone's like going on about CRISPR-Cas9. And it's like, how many CRISPR-Cas 13, 17, 25, there's so many things that have already been, because the speed of it goes so quickly, you know, once a little glimmer is had. And I think that that's something that we are, sure, look, we want to make it pushing the edge of what's possible. Like this could be an actual real thing really right now. And yet at the same time, what we're trying to do is tell a really good story. And to do that, you have to have your allegiance to the dramatic arc and the characters and the theatrical, you know, aspect of it, right? So it is a challenge to blend those things. But dude, I mean, I haven't had so much fun being challenged in a long, I mean, I'll go into the multiple decades. I mean, it's just so much fun, like trying to figure out the way to anticipate and to pre-anticipate and to like be crazy and then find out next year that that wasn't crazy at all.
In the like 1850s, this was a revelation to me, and I was thinking about it as I was reading your book. The first corneal transplants were rabbit corneas to human eyes. The first ones that worked. And there were also dogs, there were attempts with wolves, there were like many different attempts. But to think about all the things that we've been trying as a people, you know, all this time, it's about time that we got to goat humans. I mean, it makes sense that we would be there if we were looking through rabbit eyes for years and years, which we were.
Garth, what was that? I think we've talked about this. Wasn't there like a fad in the 1910s of it was goat testicles.
Yeah, goat testicles.
Implanted as like sort of sexual function.
Yes, men would have goat testicles inserted into their scrotum in order to promote longevity and make them more virile. And it was supposed to just be super awesome. And guess what? It didn't actually work, just so you know. I mean, the answer on that one didn't work. Yeah.
But that's when the mountain climbing fad took off. So REI, thanks them.
REI. Seattle-based, by the way.
This is slightly off topic, but I just am curious about it because the history of goat-human hybrid is such a long classical history. We have like all of this, the satyr plays from the classical era that we all fragments. They might have gotten eaten or something along the way, but we had the like hypersexualized satyr situation, which this does not seem to be really. They're a little they like to party, but they're not like, it's not like super kinky Fellini's Satyricon happening here. But then we also have children's literature, which is full of all the same thing, but no sexuality at all. Where do you land on that? Do you feel like, is there a sexual element to these satyr-like? They're very satyr-like, but they're just not. So far, I'm not seeing that. I'm curious.
We didn't want to like. That's an easy play, you know. We wanted to. Certainly, there will become. Obviously, all the goat characteristics that are stereotypical will be faced at some point in the 3-book series that we have. But really, to be quite honest, having spent quite a bit of time with goats, because when I knew I was going to write about goats, I needed to do my, you know, method acting approach and spend time with goats. And goats are really, it's all about contact. Human, believe it or not, and here we are on Zoom, it's all about physical contact and affection and curiosity. And if those things all, when put together in a concoction and you drink it down, make you exceptionally horny, that's probably a logical outcome to that. But if you go spend some time with goats, they will touch you, definitely. You will not walk away untouched and unexplored. And that's kind of the fun of it, I think. That's why we were going with goats, and also to kind of play into this. You know, if you notice that the OV of the book, of the title, is kind of almost an upside down anarchy symbol, right? So, you know, this idea that we demonize the unknown, right? We were talking about that in the very beginning. Maria, the idea that we demonize the things that we fear most. because that way we don't have to think about them too much. We can close the door of the cabinet and we can say, I'm leaving it locked and no one is going to get out. We're letting them out and they're going to be among you. And they are right now running among you. You just don't have the sight to realize it yet. But if you start looking, if you start lifting the veil a little bit, maybe you too can go to the jungle in Seattle and notice an encampment of cloven mutants. Just saying.
Well, on that note, I wanted to let everyone know that you can type questions into the chat box. I have not actually seen any questions yet, but I bet some of you have questions. Is that true? Everyone who is out there? You can go,
I
go
did see that
business and type quietly.
Tom Constant did put up a link to men putting goat testicles in. So if you're needing more entertainment, follow Thomas's link. Can Matt play us a tune? Oh, here we go.
I would love that. I hope he can, please.
No, I'm not going.
Oh, come on, man.
I will say this though, related to sexuality, while we haven't been dealing with sort of the hypersexual satyr thing, I found, even though we didn't really talk about this much, at least as I recall we didn't, that I was really relating to Tuck as like a sort of closeted gay kid in a small town. I kept thinking about him as this kid, not literally that the character was this, but that it was a similar experience for someone feeling isolated and alone and even freakish, and then gradually learning that no, there's a culture of people who will accept you. And so I found that much more emotional than sort of dealing with it as kind of a science fiction-y premise of, half goat, half human kind of thing. It was much more like, what's it like to feel like a freak and to discover that there are thousands of freaks just like you.
I think so many stories about monsters are as much about that as they are about just stories about loneliness and about the agony of loneliness and the revelation of love, which is what the community, I think, provides for him. Love and probably a lot of challenges that will show up in the course of the story. Mm-hmm. But finding a community of your people is usually as complicated as it is rewarding. It's when you think that you found people like you very frequently, or at least I'm speaking of my own experience of like geek community, of like going to science fiction conventions. I initially thought, it's a bunch of goats like me, basically. And then everyone is their own goat is the real truth of the matter. And in all scenarios like this, and in all human scenarios, any group thing, you discover that you are your own kind of monster, even if you have common ground with other monsters. And I think that's, it's the usual revelation, but also the thing to think about societally when we're thinking about how to change our society, which are so specific. And even when the society is saying you're a monster like all the other monsters, or you're a hero, you've done the right things, frequently there's a quirk, and the quirk is the thing that really matters.
Right. Yeah.
In terms of world-changing capacity in any direction.
You can't necessarily trust all the other monsters. They might be monstrous in ways you don't necessarily know about yet.
Yeah, or just difficult.
Yeah.
I think some of what we've all been experiencing as humans in the last little bit is like interpersonal complexities that we did not anticipate, even with our loved ones. Like, you learn things about your loved ones when you're in quarantine with them that you may never have known, even after years of knowing them. You're like, surprise, you are a person who every day talks to yourself for long periods of time, or, every writer has that complexity with their loved ones.
I am famous in my household for my spontaneous verbal comments to no one at all. And my kids always are like, what do you mean? And I'm like, what? like I don't even know I'm doing it, but I like actually say things out loud constantly, and it's very disconcerting for them. I call it my verbal Tourette's syndrome because I can't stop it. Words come out sometimes. There is this need to connect, definitely. But there is also a need for isolation in a weird way. It's like I like being by myself and just saying things out loud and hearing myself say them, but knowing that no one else is hearing that being said. So isolate, solitude is very important in our emotional background, but also community and being attached, being touch. I really believe touch is the thing. It's the physical. We crave a closeness to people or to something. Dogs, if we, animals, if people don't suit us, right? And I think that it is very confusing. And so I like, Matt's teenage, someone who's in the teen years and is trying to make decisions and choices and is dealing with all this stuff in the world. Yeah, that's Tuck. That's him, except he has hoofs.
Well, and also, right now, I mean, so many people are being sort of, they're in periods of enforced loneliness. I'm fortunate to be in a long-term relationship, and we kind of have kids together. She has kids, but I've been around a long time. So there's not that feeling of isolation, but I can't imagine what it must be like to try to meet somebody and commune with somebody right now when we're all seeing each other as these vectors of disease and the dangers of, I can't imagine, trying to hook up with and kiss somebody right now when they could literally kill me or my grandmother if I did so. So to me, there's that theme kind of runs under this second volume of the book. Now he knows he's quote unquote a monster or whatever, and is this just who he is? Is he just fated to be alone forever, or is there some possibility? Does he even want to be a part of this group that he's found? We haven't talked about it before.
I'm checking the chat thing. Eli asks Matt of you the idea of snowy fields and mountains in the sequels. Are you going to do some backpacking mountaineering for inspiration?
Not only am I, but since you asked, one of the big issues in my relationship is that my girlfriend loves to do outdoors things. We've been together for 13 years. And I just don't. I got everything I need pretty much right here in frame behind me. And then there's a bunch of guitars around the room. I don't have any need to go backpacking, except when it comes to I have to draw something set in the mountains and I want it to feel like really being in the mountains. So in a goofy way, I can't wait to go do this thing that I don't want to do.
That's good.
And it may save my relationship.
No, but it is important to experience. I mean, we make stuff up in fiction, of course. That's part of the game. But I remember when I was working on my last novel, A Sudden Light, and I was writing about people, in the top of 250-foot trees, cutting them down, and it was about the timber industry. And I just had to, I said, I got to be at the top of a tree just to feel what it feels like to be. I mean, it would be petrifying for me because I'm not a heights person, but I did. I found a climbing guru in Portland, Tim Kovar. He was awesome. He took me up into a great big, many trees, but one of our famous ones is Grandfather, who's a redwood on private land because most big trees in the forest, not in the national forest, you can't climb. You're not allowed to, because it's danger to them. Anyway, you get involved in something and you need to like be there and experience it. And we're talking about that with the light rail. We're talking about that with the jungle, like all the locations in Seattle. It's a very location-based book. So you'll see a lot of artwork that reflects kind of what's going on in Seattle. And I think it's cool to experience all that. And I know I can easily, as a writer, throw out, oh yeah, it's a diner in the North Cascades, just before the highway closes for the winter, meaning Highway 20, the North Cascades Highway. That's where we have to be at some point in book 2. And I'm like thinking, that's easy for me to say. Matt's gonna have to go there and find the diner. So
that's the fun for me. Stumptown was very much that way. Stumptown, the book that I did with Greg Rucka about 10 or 11 years ago, is set in Portland, and so I wanted it to be very, very real to Portland. And the opening of the book, there's somebody shot under a bridge, the St. John's Bridge. I went to the St. John's Bridge. It was raining, and there were all these Canada geese there. There's no Canada geese in the script, but I was like, well, that's fantastic. That's this weird thing. You got a murder or an attempted murder in front of geese. I can use that. And it turned out to be a kind of a signature moment in the book, which I got a little wrapped on the knuckles for, because it wasn't exactly what was being requested, but it worked out really well. And so that's a long way of basically saying that, yeah, I can't wait to explore the Cascades and discover that there's some weird flower that blooms in November or something like that, and find a way to work that into the pages.
Well, it's so beautiful, I think, in this book that Seattle is a character in the book. Seattle is a vibrant, interactive character, and I know the natural world will be as well, which is so appropriate for something that ultimately is instigated by the notion of climate change and trying to make a better world with a reformatted human. I love the idea of having nature, which is as monstrous as anything. Like, it's not like nature doesn't have wild, unpredictable, furious urges in the same way that we're always trying to control in our human selves. We're always like, that's not going to happen. I'm not going to do it. But nature, I think, in this book does do lots of those things. And as do the humans, the humans really are the ones that are doing most of the things in this volume. But this is it's appropriate in so many ways. I think that we are heading towards the end of our time together. Is that true? Do you guys have any last kernels of discussion that you'd like to hit in the next 2 to 3 minutes?
I see Chrissy. How old is Tuck when he gets into society? Tuck, Cloven mature faster than humans. So Tuck is fully grown before his peers. It makes it somewhat uncomfortable in his transitionary schooling of middle school at Einstein. In fact, where I went to middle school at Einstein Middle School in Shoreline. But he's a sophomore in college, essentially. You'll learn that at the end of book 2. You'll learn how he gets in. The book jumps around in time a lot with intention. So the very beginning of book 1, you're in a laboratory somewhere you don't know, and suddenly he is faced with having to escape. How he got to that laboratory, you'll know by the end of book 2. And that will explain a lot of what his age is and so forth. And is there a happy ending? David Laskin, the great, not only David Laskin, but the great David Laskin, author of The Family, as well as a book that's coming out soon that I'm reading now called What Sammy Knows, I believe. Sorry, David, I boggled your title. But do we have a happy ending for book 3? We know the ending of book 3. Whether it's happy is going to depend probably upon your perspective. But just so you know, in case everybody loves this series and wants it to keep going, and Matt just is happy to keep going with it too, I do have the opening scene of book 4 already in my head. So I'm ready to keep going.
Yes, Tuck marries Tiffany Trump.
Oh, dude,
monstrous.
Did you actually let them know that? You were supposed to.
Spoiler alert.
Carol Newman has asked a couple of times, why is Tuck called a monster? Why is that word used, I think is the question.
Yeah, Matt, you take that one.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that's sort of the kind of overriding question of the discussion that we're sort of having today. You know, like, how do you define a monster? Like, how do you define, in current political terms, how do you define a terrorist? How do you define the authorities? Like, who gets to decide who's a monster and who's a hero? And I would say that Tuck, at least the way I play him, if I were playing Tuck in the movie, thinks he's a monster. But the question is, does who you think you are make you who you are?
That's a beautiful answer.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Thank you all so much. This has been a real pleasure. Please remember that if you love this conversation, to buy a copy of The Cloven from McNally Jackson. We are so delighted to do this. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks. Good to see you guys.